By the year 1460, England was a kingdom tearing itself apart. The long and bitter struggle we now call the Wars of the Roses had already been raging for 5 long years. On one side stood the House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose and led by the gentle but ineffective King Henry VI. Henry was a man more suited to a monastery than a throne. He suffered from bouts of mental illness that left him unable to govern his kingdom for long periods. This created a dangerous power vacuum, a space that ambitious men were all too eager to fill. The country was poorly managed, justice was hard to find, and the nobles grew restless and powerful, building their own private armies. It was a recipe for disaster, a slow-burning fire that was about to erupt into a raging inferno. On the other side was the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. Their leader was the powerful and capable Richard, Duke of York. Richard was everything King Henry was not: decisive, ambitious, and a proven military leader. He was also the wealthiest man in England and had a strong claim to the throne through his own royal bloodline. Many people, tired of the chaos and weakness of Henry's reign, looked to Richard as a potential savior. They believed he could bring back order and strength to the troubled nation. This rivalry between the two houses was not just about a crown. It was a deeply personal conflict, fueled by years of jealousy, suspicion, and bloodshed that had already touched every corner of the realm. The conflict had paused and restarted several times, with each truce being more fragile than the last. An attempt at peace in 1458, known as the Love Day procession, saw the rival factions walk arm in arm to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It was a lovely piece of political theatre, but it fooled no one. The smiles were fake, and the hands that clasped each other were ready to draw swords at a moment's notice. The underlying tensions were simply too deep. The nobles had chosen their sides, and the common people were forced to live in fear, never knowing when the drums of war would sound again. The kingdom was a chessboard, and the great lords were moving their pieces, preparing for the next, decisive phase of the game. This simmering conflict finally boiled over once more in the summer of 1460. The Yorkists, led by Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who was known as the Kingmaker, achieved a major victory at the Battle of Northampton. They even managed to capture King Henry VI himself. With the king as their prisoner, the Yorkists marched back to London in triumph. Richard, Duke of York, who had been in exile in Ireland, saw his moment. He returned to England not just as a powerful duke demanding reform, but as a man ready to claim the ultimate prize. He believed the time for talking was over. The throne of England was within his grasp, and he was determined to take it, setting the stage for a dramatic and bloody confrontation. With King Henry VI a captive in London, Richard of York made his most audacious move yet. In October 1460, he marched into the Palace of Westminster, strode confidently through the Great Hall, and placed his hand upon the empty throne. It was a shocking and deeply symbolic gesture. He was not just suggesting he should rule, he was physically claiming the seat of power. The assembled lords were stunned into silence. This was not what they had expected. Many supported York's desire to reform the government, but to depose a crowned and anointed king was another matter entirely. It was a step too far for many, an act that threatened to plunge the kingdom into an even deeper crisis than the one it was already in. After much tense negotiation, a compromise was reached. It was called the Act of Accord. This law stated that King Henry VI would be allowed to keep his crown for the rest of his life. However, upon his death, the throne would not pass to his own son, Prince Edward of Westminster. Instead, the crown would go to Richard, Duke of York, and his heirs. In effect, Richard was officially named the heir to the throne, disinheriting the young prince. For Richard and his supporters, it was a stunning political victory. He had secured the future of his family and the succession of the House of York. He was now Lord Protector of England, ruling in the king's name, with the promise of becoming king himself one day. But this arrangement created a new and formidable enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Henry VI's wife was a fiercely protective mother and a determined political player in her own right. She was not about to stand by and watch her son be cast aside. For her, The act of accord was an outrageous insult and an illegal theft of her child's birthright. She saw Richard of York not as a reformer, but as a traitor who had taken advantage of her husband's weakness to steal the crown. Margaret refused to accept the deal made in London. While the Yorkists celebrated their victory in the capital, she was in the north of England, gathering an army of loyal Lancastrians, ready to fight for her son's future. Queen Margaret's fury was the spark that ignited the next and deadliest phase of the war. She was a French princess, often viewed with suspicion by the English people, but her determination was absolute. She travelled across the north, rallying the great lords who remained loyal to her husband and the House of Lancaster. Men like the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland answered her call, bringing their soldiers and their banners. Her army grew larger and larger, a formidable force bound by loyalty to the king and outrage at the Duke of York's ambition. The Queen was not just fighting for a political cause, she was fighting as a mother for her son, and that made her an incredibly dangerous opponent. Hearing news of Queen Margaret's growing army in the north, Richard, Duke of York, knew he had to act. As Lord Protector, it was his duty to put down this rebellion. In early December 1460, he marched out of London with his own army. He was accompanied by his second son, the 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and the powerful Earl of Salisbury. They headed north, expecting to crush the Lancastrian forces and secure Richard's position once and for all. However, Richard seems to have underestimated the sheer size and ferocity of the army that Margaret of Anjou had assembled. He was marching towards a hornet's nest, and he didn't seem to realize the danger he was in. On the 21st of December, the Yorkist army reached Richard's own fortress, Sandal Castle, near the town of Wakefield in Yorkshire. The castle provided a strong defensive position, perched high on a hill overlooking the surrounding countryside. From here, Richard could survey the landscape and plan his next move. His forces were significantly outnumbered by the Lancastrians, who were gathering all around the area. The logical and safer strategy would have been to stay put inside the castle walls, celebrate Christmas, and wait for reinforcements. His eldest son, Edward, was raising another army in the Welsh marches and was expected to march to his father's aid. Time was on his side if he was patient. However, patience was not one of Richard's virtues. For reasons that historians still debate today, he made a fateful and reckless decision. On the 30th of December 1460, the Duke of York ordered his army to leave the safety of Sandal Castle and march down onto the open ground below. Why did he do it? Some chroniclers say he was taunted by the Lancastrians, who goaded him into fighting. Others suggest he was tricked, perhaps by Lancastrian soldiers disguised as reinforcements, luring him out into a trap. Another theory is that his foraging parties had been attacked and he rode out to protect them, only to find himself facing the entire enemy army. Whatever the reason, it was a catastrophic military blunder. The open field, known as Wakefield Green, offered none of the protection of the castle. The Yorkist army, numbering perhaps 8,000 men, was now exposed and vulnerable. The Lancastrian forces, possibly twice that number, were hidden in the surrounding woods and valleys, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. The Duke of York, a man who had come so close to wearing the crown, had gambled everything on a single rash decision. He had abandoned his advantage and placed himself and his men in mortal peril. The stage was set for a disaster. As the Duke of York's army descended from Sandal Castle, the Lancastrian trap was sprung. The enemy forces, which had been concealed, surged forward from all sides, completely surrounding the much smaller Yorkist army. The battle was a brutal, one-sided affair from the very beginning. The Yorkists were caught in the open, with nowhere to run and no hope of an organized defense. The fight quickly devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The Lancastrians, fired up by Queen Margaret's cause and their hatred for York, showed no mercy. The battle, which took place on Wakefield Green, was less a tactical engagement and more of a massacre. In the heart of the chaos, Richard, Duke of York, fought valiantly. But courage was not enough to overcome the impossible odds. He was unhorsed, surrounded, and cut down. The man who just weeks before had been declared heir to the English throne now lay dead on a cold Yorkshire field. His death was a devastating blow to the Yorkist cause. But the tragedy did not end there. His 17-year-old son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, had tried to flee the battlefield. He was captured on Wakefield Bridge by the Lancastrian lord, John Clifford, whose own father had been killed by the Yorkists at a previous battle. Despite Edmund's pleas for his life, the vengeful Clifford stabbed him to death, shouting, "By God's blood, your father slew mine, and so will I do you." The Lancastrian victory was absolute and ruthless. After the battle, the victors indulged in acts of symbolic cruelty designed to humiliate their fallen enemies. The bodies of Richard of York, his son Edmund, and the Earl of Salisbury, who was captured and executed the next day, were all decapitated. In a final, chilling act of mockery, Queen Margaret ordered that Richard's head be placed on a spike above Micklegate Bar, one of the main gates into the city of York. To complete the insult, she had a paper crown placed upon his head, a cruel jibe at his royal ambitions. It was a gruesome warning to all who dared to challenge the House of Lancaster. The news of the disaster at Wakefield sent shockwaves across England. The Yorkist cause seemed to be in ruins. Their charismatic leader was dead, his head gruesomely displayed as a traitor's. His young son had been brutally murdered. The Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was in London, scrambling to figure out what to do next. The Lancastrian army, buoyed by their victory, began to march south towards the capital, plundering and causing destruction as they went. It seemed that Queen Margaret had triumphed, and that her son's inheritance was now secure. But in their moment of victory, the Lancastrians had unknowingly created a new and even more formidable opponent. They had not accounted for Richard's eldest son. With his father and brother dead, the leadership of the House of York fell to Richard's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. At just 18 years old, Edward was now the new Duke of York and the focus of all Yorkist hopes. He was in the Welsh Marches, near Gloucester, when he heard the devastating news from Wakefield. Where another young man might have been paralysed by grief and fear, Edward was filled with a burning desire for revenge. He was tall, handsome and charismatic, a natural warrior who possessed a tactical brilliance that even his father had lacked. He immediately took charge, transforming his personal grief into a powerful rallying cry for his followers. The war was no longer just about politics. For Edward, it was now deeply personal. Edward did not have to wait long for his first test as a leader. A Lancastrian army, led by Jasper Tudor, King Henry's half-brother, and the Earl of Wiltshire, was advancing from Wales to join Queen Margaret's main force. Edward knew he had to intercept them before they could unite. So, he moved his army to a place called Mortimer's Cross, near the border with Wales. On the 2nd of February, 1461, as the sun rose, a strange and, honestly, terrifying spectacle appeared in the sky. 3 suns were seen shining at once. This rare atmospheric phenomenon, known as a parhelion or sundog, might have panicked his troops. But Edward, with his characteristic quick thinking, turned it into a powerful omen. He declared to his nervous soldiers that the 3 suns represented the Holy Trinity, and that it was a sign that God was on their side. He told them it also symbolized the 3 surviving sons of York himself and his 2 younger brothers, George and Richard. His confident interpretation filled his men with courage and a sense of divine purpose. They went into the ensuing battle believing that victory was their destiny. This moment showcased Edward's incredible ability to inspire his men, a quality that would make him one of the most successful commanders of his age. He could turn a moment of potential fear into a source of immense strength. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross was a decisive victory for the young Duke of York. He crushed the Lancastrian army, and its leaders were captured and executed in retaliation for the deaths at Wakefield. While Edward was winning his first great victory, however, the main Yorkist army under the Earl of Warwick was suffering a defeat. Queen Margaret's northern army clashed with Warwick's forces at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February. Warwick was outmaneuvered, and his army was scattered. Crucially, the Lancastrians were able to rescue the captive King Henry VI. With her husband freed and her army at the gates of London, it seemed Queen Margaret was on the verge of final victory. The strange vision of the three sons that appeared before the Battle of Mortimer's Cross was more than just a passing curiosity. It became a core part of Edward's identity as a leader. This meteorological event, a parhelion, is caused by sunlight refracting through ice crystals in the atmosphere, creating the illusion of multiple suns. But to the medieval mind, the world was just full of signs and portents from God. A comet, an eclipse, or a strange atmospheric display. These weren't seen as natural phenomena, but as divine messages, foretelling the fall of kings or the outcome of battles. An army's morale could rise or fall based on the interpretation of such an omen. Edward's genius was in seizing this moment and really shaping its meaning. Instead of allowing his men to see the three sons as a confusing or frightening omen, he immediately proclaimed it a sign of divine favor. He declared that it represented the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, signaling that the Holy Trinity itself supported the Yorkist cause against the Lancastrians. This powerful religious message resonated deeply with his soldiers, who were about to go into battle. It transformed their anxiety into a fervent belief that they were God's chosen instruments, fighting a righteous war against traitors and usurpers. This was, honestly, a masterstroke of leadership and propaganda. After his stunning victory at Mortimer's Cross, Edward adopted the sun in splendor as his personal badge. This emblem, a shining sun with rays extending from it, became the symbol of his branch of the House of York. It was a constant reminder of the victory that God had supposedly granted him, and a powerful piece of branding for his cause. Whenever his followers saw the sun in splendor on a banner, they were reminded of the divine sign that had preceded their triumph. It represented hope, divine approval, and the promise of future victories under their charismatic young leader. It was, honestly, a far more inspiring and personal symbol than the simple white rose of his father. This celestial event and Edward's interpretation of it marked a turning point in the perception of the conflict. Richard of York's claim had been based on law and lineage, arguments that could be debated in council chambers. Edward's claim was now fused with a sense of divine mission. He was not just fighting for his inheritance, he was fulfilling a destiny that had been revealed in the heavens. This narrative was incredibly effective, attracting new followers and stealing the resolve of his existing ones. It raised the stakes of the war, transforming it from a mere dynastic squabble into a holy crusade for the soul of England, with Edward positioned as the chosen one destined to bring light and order back to the kingdom. While Edward was celebrating his victory at Mortimer's Cross, the situation near London had become desperate for the Yorkists. The Earl of Warwick had been defeated at the Second Battle of St Albans, and the victorious Lancastrian army, with Queen Margaret and the now liberated King Henry VI at its head, stood poised to enter the capital. London, however, was terrified. Reports, likely exaggerated by Yorkist propaganda, had spread about the Northern Army's supposed lack of discipline. The citizens feared that the Lancastrian soldiers, many of whom came from the rugged and often lawless border regions, would plunder and destroy their city. So, they barred the gates and refused to let the Queen's army in. This hesitation proved fatal for the Lancastrian cause. While Queen Margaret negotiated and hesitated outside the city walls, Edward and his victorious army were marching at incredible speed from the west. He linked up with the remnants of Warwick's defeated forces, and together they made for London. Unlike the Queen, Edward was welcomed as a hero. The Londoners saw him not as a threat, but as a saviour. He was young, English-born, and had just won a great victory, whereas Margaret was the foreign queen leading a feared northern host. On the 26th of February 1461, Edward and Warwick entered London to jubilant celebrations. Once inside the city, the Yorkist leaders moved quickly to capitalise on their popularity. It was clear that the Act of Accord was dead. King Henry VI was back with his wife and had broken its terms by taking up arms against his named heir. A council of Yorkist lords, including Warwick and the Duke of Norfolk, gathered and declared that Henry VI had forfeited his right to the crown. They proclaimed that the tall, handsome and victorious Edward was the rightful king. On the 4th of March 1461, in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey, the 19-year-old Edward, Duke of York, was proclaimed King Edward IV. He had seized the throne his father had died trying to win. But you know, sitting on a throne in London did not make him king of all England. The Lancastrian army was still at large, a massive and dangerous force. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret and their son were still free, and they still considered Henry to be the one true king. England now had two kings, a situation that could not possibly last. Edward knew that a proclamation was not enough. He had to destroy his enemies on the battlefield once and for all. He quickly gathered his forces, a vast army drawn from London and the southern counties, and prepared to march north. The final, decisive confrontation was coming. The two rival armies, the largest ever assembled on English soil, finally met near the village of Towton in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461. The numbers were staggering. It's estimated that somewhere between 50,000 and 75,000 men gathered to fight that day, representing a huge portion of England's adult male population. This was to be the ultimate showdown, the battle that would decide the fate of the crown. The Yorkist army was led by the new King Edward IV, a towering and inspiring figure on the battlefield. The Lancastrian army, nominally commanded by the Duke of Somerset, was fighting for the cause of King Henry VI, who waited anxiously at a safe distance in the city of York. The day of the battle was bitterly cold. A fierce snowstorm blew directly into the faces of the advancing Lancastrians. The Yorkist archers, commanded by the wily Lord Fauconberg, used this to their advantage. They fired a volley of arrows with the wind at their backs, which carried them deep into the Lancastrian ranks. Then, they stepped back. The Lancastrian archers, blinded by the snow and unable to see how far their own arrows were falling, shot back. Their arrows, fighting against the wind, fell short, landing harmlessly in the empty space between the two armies. The clever Yorkists then advanced, collected the enemy's arrows from the ground, and fired them back. This simple but brilliant tactic inflicted terrible casualties before the hand-to-hand fighting even began. The main battle was a brutal and relentless slog that lasted for 10 long hours. It was fought with swords, axes and polearms in the freezing snow and mud. The sheer scale of the fighting was horrific, a desperate and bloody struggle across a wide plateau. At one point, the Yorkist line began to buckle under the immense pressure of the Lancastrian numbers. But just as it seemed they might break, Yorkist reinforcements, led by the Duke of Norfolk, arrived late in the day and slammed into the Lancastrian flank. This was the turning point. The Lancastrian line shattered, and the soldiers, exhausted after hours of fighting, broke and ran. What followed was a horrifying slaughter. The fleeing Lancastrians were pursued for miles by the vengeful Yorkist cavalry. Many tried to escape across a stream known as Cock Beck, but a bridge over it reportedly collapsed, or became so choked with the bodies of the fallen, that men were said to have crossed over on the corpses of their comrades. The stream ran red with blood for days. The death toll was catastrophic. Chroniclers of the time claim that over 28,000 men were killed at Towton, a number that is likely an exaggeration but still points to an almost unimaginable loss of life. It remains the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The victory at Towton was total. The Lancastrian army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. King Edward IV had secured his throne with a river of blood. In the aftermath, the defeated Lancastrian leaders who were captured faced swift and brutal justice. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret and their son managed to escape the slaughter and fled north, eventually seeking refuge in Scotland. But their cause was broken, their armies scattered, and their hopes of reclaiming the throne seemed distant. Edward IV returned to London and was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey in June 1461. At just 19 years old, he was the undisputed master of England. The country he now ruled was exhausted and deeply scarred. The intense period of fighting between December 1460 and March 1461 had seen 4 major battles: Wakefield, Mortimer's Cross, St Albans, and Towton, and a level of bloodshed that shocked the nation. Almost every noble family had lost someone, and the fields of Yorkshire were littered with the graves of tens of thousands of ordinary men. The immediate task for the new king was to bring peace and order back to his shattered kingdom. He needed to heal the deep divisions, restore royal authority, and convince the people that the long nightmare of civil war was finally over. Edward IV began his reign with promise. He was a strong and decisive ruler, unlike the feeble Henry VI. He worked to restore the crown's finances, promote trade, and enforce justice across the land. For a time, it seemed as though a new era of peace and prosperity might finally be dawning. He tried to unite the country, offering pardons to some former Lancastrians who were willing to swear loyalty to him. The hope was that England could move on from the bitter rivalry of the red and white roses and rebuild itself as a unified nation under a strong Yorkist king. People longed for stability after years of uncertainty and violence. However, the scars of war ran deep, and the peace was fragile. The defeated Lancastrians had not simply vanished. Queen Margaret remained a determined enemy, plotting her return from exile. Even within the victorious Yorkist camp, tensions would soon emerge, particularly between King Edward and his powerful cousin, the so-called Kingmaker, Earl of Warwick. While Edward's victory at Towton had ended one chapter of the Wars of the Roses, it had not ended the story. The blood spilled in the snow of 1461 had bought him a crown, but the struggle for power was far from over, leaving a legacy of hope mixed with a lingering sense of uncertainty for the future of England.